Recording in progress. Okay. I'm going to be talking about a book that's not really a book. It's really more of a scrapbook. I'm going to show you a little bit of it right now. But then most of my talk is going to be giving background to what I've shown you right now. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of it right now. This is the Smithsonian. This book, I have to say, was lost for many, many years. And we only know about this thing because a historian named Randall in the 1850s wrote letters to a number of Jefferson's grandchildren, getting information about him. And several of them told him that he had written a book, he had prepared a book that he used to read every night as his own sort of private devotional. And they actually gave this Randall a copy of Jefferson's handwritten table of contents, but they did not share the book with him. And then in the 1880s, a man named Cyrus Adler, who was the curator of Semitic religion at the Smithsonian, earlier in his life had been a bibliographer in Baltimore, and he had done a analysis of a book collection of a Baltimore book collector, and he noticed that there were 2 copies of the New Testament in there with a lot of holes cut in the text. He was puzzled about that, and then he looked at these books, and there was a little clipping in one of the books saying that these were Bibles that Jefferson had used to construct his private devotional book. And he tried to buy that for the Smithsonian, but the person wouldn't sell it. And then about 15 years later, he discovered that actually one of Jefferson's great-granddaughters had it. She was the daughter of Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's favorite grandson, who kind of managed Monticello for him. And when Thomas Jefferson Randolph died, he kept Jefferson's manuscripts, and he gave this manuscript, this collected Bible thing, scrapbook, to his daughter Susan. She died in 1890 and gave it to her sister Caroline. So Cyrus Adler discovered that this Caroline had this book, and so he went to her and he bought it from her for $400. Wow, which is it's amazing. I guess that was quite a sum then, but it'd be worth millions and millions now. So the world sort of learned about it in 1895, and the Smithsonian was preparing a traveling exhibition on early Bibles and so forth. And so it included in its tour this sort of Bible had been cut to pieces. And then finally in 1905, they took pictures of this Bible, and it was first available for scholars. But the original book was so fragile that finally about 2005, Smithsonian decided to really take it completely apart, have it rebound, and have a facsimile made so that it's now available. So this is the facsimile. It looked exactly, it doesn't have this fancy title, but it's bound like this. It was bound by a binder in Richmond named Mayo, Fred Mayo, and it has really nice end papers. You see the end papers, and then there's a long introduction here, and then Jefferson had attached to the inside the book his table of contents. It's 3 pages, and his very tiny little immaculate printing. It's about as legible as typewriter. He's an amazing. I say this because a lot of writing was very difficult to read. And then he has his title page, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And says, extracted textually from the Gospels in Greek, Latin, French, and English. So what he did in 1820, he had done an earlier version of this in 1804, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But in 1820, he's out of the presidency. His last day in the presidency was March 8, 1809. So he's retired in Monticello. He got 4 copies of the New Testament in Greek, Latin, French, and English, 2 copies of each. And then he takes a little penknife and he cuts out very carefully in little rectangles. He cuts out the quotations he thinks are the legitimate quotations of Jesus. Now, I'm going to make very clear when he says legitimate, because he thinks the Bible, he realizes that Jesus didn't write anything. And what we know from him, or what his believers or whatever wrote down 50 or 70 or 100 years later from memory. And so he thinks it's almost a miracle that anything close to what he really said existed. But he thinks that a lot of the things that were written down by his disciples were hearsay or made up, or not quite, maybe not quite true. He thought maybe even the early church fathers, to give themselves more power and so forth, had to add a lot to the Bible and made it a whole lot more complex. He particularly thought that the church had sort of unnecessarily complexified the Bible so that people will be dependent upon them to understand it. Because he said Jesus spoke with a clarity that a child could understand it, and it was and the church and all these complicated concepts like the Trinity, those are things that priests had invented that Jesus had never mentioned. So he believed what he wanted to do is to, in some sense, get back to the authentic, original Jesus that he believed you could find in the Gospels. And he said, he used this phrase 3 or 4 times. He says, the authentic words of Jesus are as obvious in the Bible as he says, diamonds in a dunghill. And so his test was to take the Gospels and to carve off all the extraneous stuff and all the added stuff and get down to the core beliefs, the core statements of Jesus. He never really works out in any, he never describes in great detail his methodology for determining exactly what they are. He just says they're as obvious as, again, diamonds in a dunghill. And then he once he's decided on that, he takes these 4 translations of the Bible and he goes through and he's going to compile them in sort of chronological order. In 1804, he'd done a smaller version of this called the Philosophy of Jesus that was sort of thematically organized. This is going to be organized biographically, so it's linear. And he goes through and he cuts from each translation of the Bible, he cuts out the verses that he thinks are the authentic words of Jesus. And then he bought some paper. He bought sheets of paper that were 19 inches by 24 inches. He cuts them up, makes each of those into 6 pages. And then he takes a page, he draws a line down the middle, and then he very carefully cuts out these little clippings and he pastes them in 4 columns by language. So for example, you can see here, this is what it looks like. This is the original page. Over here is the English version. Here is the French version. Here is the Latin version, and here is the Greek version. So he has a sort of a parallel 4 language version of the New Testament. And then it's not at all a complete New Testament, because Jefferson does not believe in miracles. He doesn't believe in revelation. He doesn't believe in anything that he thinks reason doesn't give assent to. So he is, in addition to looking just for the language he thinks is the authentic language of Jesus, he's also excluding anything that he thinks suggests miraculous intervention or unreasonable, unscientific. And I'm going to talk about later what a big thing in Jefferson's life reason was. Reason for us, most people today use the word reason as like an excuse, like the reason I was late because there was a lot of traffic or something like that, you know. But for Jefferson, reason meant the operation of the brain upon sensory perception. Sensory perception are sight, sound, so forth, feeling. And he thought these sensory perception were received by the brain, and then the brain operates on it, and then the brain comes to meaningful conclusions. And if something, if the brain, he says that when God created man, God inserted into the inner being of men reason. He says reason is as much a part of human life as is sight or as hearing or anything else. It's automatic if you will listen to it, if you'll observe it, if you'll practice it. So then he wants to then take these authentic words of Jesus And then everything else he wants to solve is, he says, make it pass over the bar of reason. If it doesn't pass the test of reason, then he's going to exclude it. So it's going to be a short, demythologized, rational version of the New Testament. And you see here, I mean, if you look really close, you can actually see each little quote, each little thing he's cut out, and he tapes them in, he glues them in. And so he basically made a scrapbook about 80 pages long, and then he had it bound. And this is exactly what it looked like. And he kept this by his bed, and he later said several times that at night, the last thing he would do for about a half hour, or maybe an hour, is he would read through this, and he would study, and he would contemplate what he thought were the authentic words of Jesus. And then when it was rediscovered in the late 19th century, and then it was printed in 1905 photographically, people began calling it the Jefferson Bible. And it's gone through many, many different editions. And it's not at all what Jefferson had in mind. Jefferson did not write this as a book. He didn't even show it to his children. This was his private meditation. Jefferson never talked to his children about religion, or because he thought very much that religion was something totally between an individual and his or her God. And he did not want to try to shape the opinions of anyone. He thought that was inappropriate. And he knew, given his prestige and fame and so forth, if he talked to his children about religion in a very complicated way, they would sort of believe it because he said it. And he thought that's not the reason you should believe anything. You should believe it because you've studied it. And these words have,
because it's reasonable.
reasonable, not because the prestige of the person who said it. So he would have turned over in his grave if he thought we had this book and people were reading it and writing about it. So that's that. At the end, I'm going to talk about this sort of compilation. And again, because the Jefferson Bible, it's really kind of scrapbook. And you can see when Nancy and I were in graduate school, Nancy worked in the rare book room, and there's a vault there, and they had a couple of these Bibles that Jefferson had used. You could open the Bible up, and all through it were these little holes, square holes, where Jefferson had cut it. And he had to have two versions of the Bible because sometimes he cut it on the other side too. So you can actually. How was it that Jefferson got to the point that in 1820 he goes to the trouble of working out, basically writing or compiling his own version of the gospel of Jesus? Well, we do know that at an early age, Jesus was quite orthodox, I guess you would say. I mean, his parents were members of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church becomes the Episcopal Church, was the state church of Virginia. So his parents were members of the Anglican Church. And Jefferson was baptized. And there were no public school system. So Jefferson's first schooling was in the home of several Anglican ministers. Several of them were not very good, but he particularly liked a minister named James Maury. You probably know a little bit about James Maury. If you remember vaguely from high school, something in colonial Virginia called the Parsons Cause. The parson behind the Parsons Cause was James Maury. But he was a very learned minister. And Jefferson really bonded with him. And we do know that from a little pamphlet that James Maury wrote in 1772, he said that no person should be expected to believe any aspect of church theology that does not fit his conception of what is reasonable. So we're pretty sure that Jefferson, if he didn't already know it, had been influenced with his teacher when he was 14 or 15 years old. Jefferson, when he was 17, went off to the College of William and Mary. And his favorite professors there, his favorite was a guy named William Small, who had a PhD from Edinburgh, and was very much a man of the Enlightenment, and really emphasized the value of reason. He also was very much impressed by his law professor, George Witt, who all similarly emphasized the role of reason. We know that sometime, probably 1763, 1764, Jefferson came to reject much of the orthodoxy of the Anglican Church. One of the reasons we know this is because Jefferson read a lot, and he took notes on what he read. And he had a book we call this commonplace book, where he would write down long quotations from authors that he particularly liked. And this book exists. So you can read through this book and you can read what Jefferson was reading, and you can tell what impressed him because that's what he made long excerpts from. And the person he made the most excerpts from in his commonplace book was an 18th century British kind of rationalist named Bolingbroke, Viscount Bolingbroke. Jefferson has about 60 pages of quotations from Bolingbroke. And Bolingbroke was almost a caricature of a rationalist who threw out nearly every aspect of the Bible. And Jefferson was very impressed by the rigorous way that Bolingbroke applied reason. And Jefferson also at this time begins to read a lot of the philosophy of Greek and Roman authors, people like Seneca and Epictetus. And he particularly liked the Stoic writers. And he began to reject a great deal of what we call orthodoxy. And among the things he began to reject from his Anglican upbringing were, again, the idea of the Trinity. He said that's irrational. 3 and 1, 1 and 3 doesn't make sense. And he discounted miracles, things like, turning water into wine or multiplying fish and bread to feed 5,000 and all kinds of miraculous healings and so forth. And he began to believe, this is when he was a college student. He was 17 when he went to college and when he married. He began to reject a great deal of his early teachings. I think it's even typical today that kids go to Sunday school and so forth, and they go to college and they go through a period of reading other kinds of things, thinking things, meeting different people, and they kind of move away from the church and they come back to it later, maybe when they have a family or whatever. Jefferson does that. We don't, unfortunately, Jefferson never writes in a diary, this is when I really began to doubt. But if you read, once for a project, I decided to read everything Jefferson wrote. I have to say he wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of volumes. So I just began, I thought, being kind of simple-minded, I'd do it literally. So I read Jefferson's first letter, second letter, third letter, 30,000th letter. You just read through them. And as you read through them, you can begin subtly to see how people, in just offhand comments, their views are subtly beginning to change. So it seems to me that sometime in the early mid-1770s, Jefferson begins to move away from his respect for the writers of antiquity. In this period when he was really questioning Christianity, he said the best moral teachers were the Greek and Roman philosophers. And he became a huge devotee of particularly the historical writers of Greek and Rome. Somehow in the 1770s, he begins to shift a little bit back, I think, toward rereading the Gospels. Don't really quite know why. I think in 1777, 1778, you can see in some of his political writings, he seems to be taking sort of Christianity more seriously. He learns about a very liberal Anglican minister in England named Richard Price, and he corresponds with Richard Price quite a bit, particularly when Jefferson in 1784 goes to France to be the U.S. minister to Paris, France. He gets in closer contact by correspondence with Richard Price. In 1785, John Adams, who had been in Paris before Jefferson, goes to England to become the American ambassador to England. And Richard Price becomes the minister of John Adams. So I should point out that all these people, John Adams and Franklin and Madison, they all share a great number of beliefs. Anyway, so Jefferson becomes much more familiar with the writings of Richard Price, again, an Anglican minister who was a rationalist, who was again pushing in the direction of rejecting some aspects of the Bible that were too miraculous. He also, this is combining with his earlier reading of Bolingbroke. So Jefferson now is beginning to read Richard Price. And then in 1782, a very famous English chemist and theologian named Priestley. Priestley wrote a book in 1782 called The History of the Corruptions of Christianity. Don't exactly know when Jefferson read that. I do know that he bought a copy of it in 1792. Jefferson has a list of all his books and when he bought them. So you can always tell when Jefferson's, and he also makes annotations to these books. So I know that sometime after 1792, he began really closely reading Priestley's History of the Corruptions of Christianity. And that title tells you why Jefferson's going to find it interesting, because he thinks what happens in church by adding all kinds of mystery stuff had unnecessarily complicated the Bible to benefit the ministers and to disadvantage the lay people. But Priestley, even though he rejected it a lot, remained a Christian, whereas Bolingbroke, it's kind of doubtful that he was. So Jefferson really begins to read Priestley, and then he begins to see that it's possible to reject some of the excess, but at the core of it, there is a kernel of incredibly valuable truth. So, and Jefferson actually, Priestley moved to the United States in 1793. We know that Jefferson met him in Philadelphia in 1794. But so in the late 1790s, Jefferson begins to reread the Gospels. And he begins to reread the Gospels with an intensity that he had never read before. And it's at this time that he really begins to turn away from the primary value he gave to those philosophers of antiquity, and to, in some sense, begin to reject the philosophers of ancient Rome and Greece, and to move in the direction of rediscovering Jesus. Now, I'd go into a lot of how Jefferson felt about reason. And we know what he felt about reason, not because he so much talks about it in an autobiographical sense, but that he often writes letters to people. For example, he had a young nephew named Peter Carr. Peter Carr's father had been Jefferson's best friend. Peter Carr died. Father died at a very early age, Dabney Carr. So Jefferson sort of takes on the education of Peter. And he writes Peter a number of letters about how to become educated. And he says, use reason to determine what you want to believe. And he believed that, he begins to see that he basically becomes a deist, but a deist of a particular kind, not the kind of deist who, like with a clockworker, and set the universe into operation and then sort of retired, but a deist, a God who was not only had created the universe and had created the laws of nature, but constantly was involved, was constantly manipulating, was constantly controlling, so that God was not at all distant or removed, but God is sustaining the world all the time. I have here all kinds of quotes about that. I'm not going to read to you, but I could, letter after letter after letter. This is a letter he wrote to Peter Carr. Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. He advised him that you should question with boldness even the existence of God, because if such a being does exist, he would certainly more approve the homage of reason than a blindfolded fear. He said, your own reason is the only oracle given you by heaven, and you are answerable not for the rightness, but the uprightness of the decision. Now, Jefferson also, his entire life, lived a very conventional Christian life. He attended church. He was a member of the local Anglican church. He contributed to it. He paid to have his children baptized. He paid to have the ministers preach at the funeral of his mother and his best friends. Jefferson kept a very detailed account book. Every cent he ever spent, he recorded. And so if he's in Paris, he goes to a concert, he tells how much ticket bought and what he heard. And so you can tell going through his account book, you'll see he pays so-and-so for Minister Cassius Clay to preach the funeral sermon. So you don't, I'm not just guessing this, you can tell it because Jefferson has made a little one-line thing, pay minister for a funeral sermon. So you can reconstruct all this life. So here he is in the 1790s, this man who believes that reason is the only oracle given to humans by God. It's as much a part of our life as breathing and seeing and so forth. And the role of reason is to take sensory perception, what you see and reading here, operate on it, and then produce meaning or truth. So he begins, and then he again reject all kinds of things that are unreasonable. So by the 1790s, he is much more appreciative of the gospel. He writes to Joseph Priestley in 1800. Priestley had written a little book called Jesus and Socrates Compared, in which Priestley had argued that Jesus' moral writings are more valuable than Socrates. And Jesus wrote him basically saying, right on. He said, what you ought to do now is to do this, to take all the ancient philosophers and compare them all to Jesus and show that Jesus' moral writings are superior to all those of antiquity. That is, it's a complete rejection of the Jefferson's beliefs of the early 1770s. Priestley might have done that, but he died within a few weeks of getting a letter back from Jefferson. Jefferson also is aware that laws in Virginia are very strict. There's a state law, state religion, and it's against the law. It's actually a capital offense to disbelieve the Trinity. And there are all kinds of strict laws that, in theory, the state can take children away from parents who were not Orthodox. So Jefferson realizes that his beliefs is widely known. It caused him to be put in jail. And he was very aware that the Baptists who were coming into Virginia, beginning in the 1760s and preaching with great success in the 1770s, their church services were often interrupted by civil officials, sheriffs, and the ministers were put into jail or horsewhipped and so forth because the doctrines they were preaching were not Orthodox Anglican theology, and the Anglican Church is the state church. And so Jefferson was so influential and such an aristocrat, I guess you'd say, that he was probably safe from being arrested. But he didn't like the fact that here was a state in which, by the whim of a sheriff, you could be put in jail for what you said or what you believed in church. So he is going to become very early on the foremost defender of religious freedom. In 1778, Jefferson, along with two other legislatures, the Virginia Assembly, was assigned the task of rewriting all the laws of Virginia. And Jefferson saw this as a great opportunity to kind of complete the revolution. So he's going to write a whole series of laws. Almost none of them are accepted, but Jefferson's, about a century ahead of everybody else in Virginia. So much of what he advocates, people don't accept. But for example, he advocates a public education system in Virginia, whereby all white boys and girls will be given free 3 years of public education. And then you take out the most select every year, the most select 10 boys, and then the most select of that, you got to the top 10. And then those top 10 would be given a complete free 4-year college education. Because he thought that in a place in which laws were based on voting, you should have people voting who not just the children of aristocrats, but the average people. And he believed there were geniuses scattered throughout the whole population. Now, of course, this idea of free public education was anathema to Virginia. Virginia doesn't have free public education until 1907. Jefferson advocated it in 1788. So you see, he's a little ahead of time. He also was very concerned about religious freedom. So in 1778, he writes out a very famous bill that we know of is the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It's one of the most important documents in 18th century American history because it really lays out the philosophy of religious freedom. And it's later going to become the basis of the First Amendment. And it's the basis of our conception of freedom of religion. Now, before it gets passed, of course, it meets terrible opposition. And Jefferson's actually sent to France before it finally gets passed. But luckily, James Madison come along, and Jefferson talked to Madison a lot, and so Madison pushes it through the State House. So it passes in 1786. Now, this is the beginning of Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments of burthens or by civil incapacitations, not tend not only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore are a departure from the plan of our holy and authorized religion. And he goes on to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. He says our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions on physics or geometry. And therefore, the prescribing any citizen as unworthy of public confidence, laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust or emolument, unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. And he goes on to talk about in his autobiography how this was written clearly to not just to defend the Christian religion, but to give people religion, freedom of religion, whether you were a Hindu or Mohammedan. He says it's silly. I mean, you're not making much of a statement if you defend the right to say popular things. Freedom of opinion means people have the right to express or believe unpopular things. So Jefferson makes very clear that by this Virginia statute of religious freedom, he means not just the freedom to be a Baptist rather than an Episcopalian, but the freedom to be, he would say, a Mohammedan. And then it goes on, be it the truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. He says, be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same will in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So he's going to, and one of the reasons he begins to push for religious freedom, because he's very aware by this time that his doubting of the Trinity basically means he could be put to jail, and that his doubting of miracles and so forth means that his children could be taken from him. So for Jefferson, complete religious freedom is not just an intellectual proposition, it really comes home. And he sets himself a goal really quite early of being an opponent to depriving people of complete religious freedom. He writes a famous letter to Benjamin Rush on September 23, 1800, in which he said, I like this quotation, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal vigilance against every form of tyranny against the mind of men. And that's going to be, in some sense, a really important theme of Jefferson's life. Sworn on the altar of God, eternal vigilance against every form of tyranny against the mind of man. He writes a letter in 1820, talked about the illimitable freedom of the human mind. So Jefferson is, you see, there are a lot of things going on here. His huge belief in reason, his belief in religious freedom, his belief now that the Bible, even though it's cluttered with all kinds of unnecessary stuff, and theologists confuses it, and in fact, at the kernel of it, there's a basic truth that people should know. He has a lot of wonderful quotations and letters and so forth, talking about his religious beliefs and reason, which I love, but I don't have time to go into it. And then in 1803, and he realizes that even though he had written to Joseph Priestley saying, I wish you'd do a bigger book, not just comparing Socrates and Jesus, but comparing all the ancient philosophers with Jesus, Priestley dies. And so Jefferson begins to think about who else could do this. And he begins to sort of set up in his mind what would be the kind of essential statements that such a book would write. So he writes a 2-page document called a syllabus. We think of a syllabus like a classroom, but it's a kind of a little short statement of what he thought should be the essence of such a book that he thought somebody should write. And first he says, we have to acknowledge that the ancient philosophers did one important thing. They wrote, particularly the Stoics, they wrote about and they thought about how men should develop beliefs to control their passions. He thought that was a very important contribution of the ancient philosophers. And then he thought the Jews came along and improved that Because the Jews, he said, made the argument very effectively that there's one true God. And so he gives credit for the Jewish religion for the idea of monotheism. He does not like all the kind of complicated, to him are kind of silly dietary rules and so forth. And he thinks that the Jewish religion is too narrowly focused on its own people. He thinks the Jewish religion is insufficiently universal. And he thinks and the next great step, he thinks, is that Jesus is a reformer of the Jewish religion. And Jesus universalizes his belief. He wants to argue that people should love all mankind, and that his attitudes and his morality and so forth are applicable to everybody. And so he thinks, and he also believes that Jesus writes with a clarity, that Jesus's writings on morality are the clearest, he says, the purest morsels we have of moral thinking. And he also says that Jesus makes very clear the idea of an afterlife. He says one of the failures of Judaism is it either doesn't care about or disbelieves the idea of an afterlife, life after death. So for Jefferson, the essentials of an authentic religion would be that it helps people to control their passions. The idea of one God, monotheism, the universality of those beliefs, and the idea that if you believe those things and if you act in a moral way, you'll be rewarded after life with life after death. Early in his life, he thought this afterlife was maybe more reward for behaving or believing, practicing the moral precepts of Jesus. But as he got older, for him, the kind of chief attraction of life after death was being able to be reunited with loved ones, his wife, his children, his parents, So anyway, so that becomes the sort of central, Jefferson says in this little 2-page document, that the essence of a theological statement would be religion control your passions, one true God, the moral principles laid down by Jesus, and the reward after life of death. And so he says, let's go through the New Testament then, and let's choose those things. Now, in 1804, he did a shortened version of this, just in the English translation. He gets 2 copies of the Bible, cuts out the verses he likes, and he arranges them in order in a thematic way, talking about the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's never been found. It has been reconstructed because they did find his table of contents in which he tells the verses that he used. So the editors of the Princeton University Press, who were publishing the papers of Jefferson about 90 volumes, they did this volume called Jefferson's Extracts from the Gospels. And they found out the edition of those 2 Bibles that he had used in 1804. And they found 2 copies of those Bibles, one in Europe, one in America, in various book libraries. And they photographed those Bibles. And then they cut out the quotes that Jefferson said he was using. And so then they kind of pasted together and sort of reproduced the version of Jefferson's philosophy. And then they put it here. This is not Jefferson's. This is where they have basically photographed the same edition of the Bible, cut them out and pasted them together and made sort of replicated it. But Jefferson thought he said that took him, he said, a couple of days. It wasn't complete enough. And as he read more and more and thought about the role of religion and the way the way the church was, he thought was manipulating reason, he thought actually that one reason some people didn't believe the church, but there was things in there that you're required to believe he thought were unreasonable. I mean, the earth standing still, or the river clapping its hands, or all kind of, the miracle. Yeah, he just that stuff is hard to believe. He said, basically, if you start out by being asked to believe too much, you'll believe too little. So if we can get down to what is the essential, what is it? So he sets himself this test. And question?
John, I'm sorry, we would have to leave and I have curiosity.
Okay.
He does not believe in miracles. It's very clear. He said in the text.
Yeah.
Does he try to explain what they mean or
No.
just- No.
No.
Okay.
No. And that's kind of odd because you wonder what would have made Jesus's teaching so attractive if he took out all the miracle stuff, because clearly that people noticed that.
Right.
Jefferson, I think, assumes everybody was as reasonable as he was. When he created University of Virginia, he thought he doesn't talk about it. But so that when he creates University of Virginia, he assumes every young man coming to University of Virginia are going to be like him,
Yeah.
consumed with interest in religion and study, unbelievably methodical. He's going to devote 15 hours a day to study. He doesn't realize these kids who are the kind of spoiled brats of planners, and they gamble and the horse race and all of that. That's not them. And so they riot and they throw bottles of urine through the windows of the minister's house. They're just Jefferson so upset he cries because he assumed that every young man come to UVA would be just like a young Jefferson. Well, there weren't many Jeffersons.
We're all LeBron James. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh,
Sorry to interrupt you.
So anyway, so he spends months and he very carefully takes these books apart. I have to say he does make some mistakes. And one of the valuable things of this Princeton edition is that they have in the back a whole series of many, many pages of notes in which their team of scholars have taken every verse in every language and then compared it to the original. And they see where sometimes he actually left out a word or he put in a word. So it's unbelievably meticulous work. But he puts together these 4 versions. And then the result, he has it bound by this printer, this book publisher, book printer in Richmond. And he reads it every night. Now you start reading this, it's called, the life and morals of Jesus. But it doesn't begin with the manger scene. It doesn't, they're not angels floating in the sky. It begins with Jefferson, basically a teenager. And all the kind of things that we think of, Jefferson talked about feeding himself in a Sabbath, and or healing somebody with a withered hand, a miracle, or people who are inhabited by demons, and people who are blind. That is totally absent. There's within about 10 verses, he's 12 years old and he goes to Jerusalem. And he stays behind, his parents leave. And he is impressing everybody with his knowledge and so forth. And says Jesus increased in wisdom and stature. And then he talks about meeting John the Baptist. And it basically tells all the stories we know, but every miracle story. He loves Jefferson's parables, because what he likes about the parables, Jefferson there is in very simple, understandable language, making complicated ideas understandable. And he thinks that's in some sense the essence of Jesus, that he has this ability to take unbelievably profound ideas, then express them in ways that a child can understand. You don't need theologians. You don't need books. You just kind of listen and your reason will tell you. There are no miracles. Once or twice he inadvertently mentions angels. And I don't know why, because it seems to me that angels would transcend this.
Unreasonable.
But he does do that. He talks about the end when Jefferson's going to be crucified. There's no rising from the tomb. There's no resurrection. As I say, it's a demythologized or mystified, very rationalistic, down to earth Jesus.
It's the philosophy of Jesus Christ.
But he's telling it though in the sense of his biography. Okay.
How does he deal with dialogue where You miss the story if you don't hear the questions.
I don't, he's writing this for himself. So I think that explains a lot. And maybe he were intending this to be more widely dispersed.
But the Pharisee asks a question and he bounces back with.
He don't have some of that. He'll have some of that. He does not believe that Jesus is divine.
It is not.
And he says that nowhere in the New Testament did Jesus explicitly say, I am the co-equal of God. And he believed that Jesus is not divine, but instead is the most perfect example of a man who ever lived. That he exemplifies for us the kind of person who lived according to the morality that he laid out. And that Jesus should be respected and should be honored and so forth because of the kind of life he believed, not that he's divine. Of course, to disbelieve in the divinity of Christ was also an incredibly heretical thing then, much less to disbelieve in the Trinity. So Jefferson, one reason he keeps his secret is he knows that he had been condemned, certainly in the 1790s, election of 1800 by the Federalists for being an atheist and for being an enemy of religion. Jefferson says one reason he wrote his syllabus, and one reason he writes this, he wants his children to know that he is not an enemy to religion. He says he's writes several times. He says, I am in fact a Christian the way Jesus wanted, a person who accepted his beliefs, lived by his beliefs, and did no other. So now there's been a great debate in the 20th century. Is Jefferson an atheist, or is he a deist, or is he an evangelical? There are some people who argue he's an evangelical, Orthodox Christian. There's no way in the world, unless you're just flat out stupid, you can say that he is an Orthodox Christian. He is not an atheist. He believes very much in God.
Please do.
He is a deist, but of the kind of a deist who intervenes in the world constantly. He says, basically, we're not alone. God is controlling events. So he is that. Okay.
Yeah, how does he reconcile this idea of universality with being a slave owner?
Has nothing to do with it. He believes the slaves should believe in Jesus, and Jesus preaches to them. And
That there is no, that he believes that is, that social inequality
yes,
is fine.
no, he doesn't. But we have to decide, we can't really think as 21st century people. I mean, incredible inequality that existed in all human society. And slavery and serfdom existed all over the world. And people accepted or understood that there were gradations in human rights and so forth. Jesus actually does believe that slavery is morally wrong. And I could give a whole lecture, a couple lectures on why he gets stuck and he can't get out of it. But Jefferson does believe that Jesus often comes to speak to those who are disinherited, to those who are poor, those, so in some sense, Jesus's message is more viable to them than anybody else. And but he does not believe that the Bible, that Jesus dissolves all social distinctions in the world. He does his entire life believe that slavery is wrong. He does not see, again, how it can be solved in this nation. He does believe that eventually, because it is wrong, and God knows it's wrong, that in God's good time, God will find a way to end slavery. Jefferson doesn't know how he's going to do that. That's
He
one of
doesn't
the,
take it as his responsibility
No,
to act on that
well,
in his lifetime.
well, for complicated reasons. I mean, Jefferson believed that even as president, he did not have the right to kind of wave a magic wand and say the slaves are free, because he thought a democracy, key decisions had to be determined by the vote of the people. That doing it like by a magic wand is the way dictators believed. And even if he thought it was a right decision, that in a democracy, even the right decisions to be determined by the voting public. And so he spends his life hoping that the new generation will be more advanced than his and will see their way to ending slavery. It turns out, of course, when he's saying that, the cotton gin hadn't been invented. And so, he doesn't foresee the convention of cotton gin in 1793 and the fact that cotton and slavery are going to be more firmly attached to the American soil in, say, 1825 than it was in 1775. But I mean, as smart as Jefferson is, he doesn't foresee the future. And
if we could foresee this future,
Yeah.
if he had lived another 100 years, he would have discovered what people who were Orthodox Christians discovered. And that is that if you read the gospel according to Mark, which has no birth story or no resurrection
Yeah.
story. And if you added into that, now this is where it gets complicated, but bear with me for a minute. You take Matthew, forget John, take Matthew and Luke. And you take what's in Matthew and Luke that are the same. And you took them out of Matthew and Luke. You would have, quote, in German, Quelle, which is the source.
Yeah.
Jesus teaching, what Jesus said, recorded by two different people, sometimes in different ways, Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, etc. And so if you took the Quelle, that's the source of Jesus' teaching, and Mark, you would come to exactly the same conclusion about what the Christian faith is.
I wouldn't say exactly, we come very close.
Yeah,
And
really,
he does, I mean, you can see that he doesn't have the concept of the Quella. There's also concept there as a law source, but they both draw on.
exactly.
But he is in some sense trying to work backwards to get to the, now, this doesn't seem at all controversial to us, like the Jesus seminar and so forth. But the idea in 1790 or 1800 that you would cut up the New Testament, that in itself
You
was,
belong in jail.
yeah, I mean, so what he's doing by even raising doubt about these kind of things is revolutionary.
I wouldn't try it publicly today.
Well, no.
In this
Yeah.
context.
But again, Jefferson is trying to create a rational version of Jesus's morality that will appeal to modern people and will, in some sense, diminish the authority of the church. And when he's thinking of the church, I mean, he's been in France. He's seen the kind of chokehold the Catholic Church has on the, so when he talks about the priest and so forth, he's not talking about Methodists and Baptist ministers. He has in his mind the power of the great rich church in England. That he's trying to rescue, he's trying to create a version of Jesus that fits our time in a democratic society that he thinks will revolutionize the society. Now, he has been so unbelievably attacked and condemned for his religious viewpoints. He doesn't say this publicly, but he thinks in some way that his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom is going to make possible that kind of evolution of beliefs. Jefferson's going to actually say, as you know, on his tombstone, he says, he wants to say, "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and founder of the University of Virginia." And you think about political freedom, religious freedom, and freedom from ignorance. In some sense, that idea of freeing the American mind. So he doesn't talk about the president or anything else. So this little book, I mean, it's fun to just kind of fun to read in your own mind. Think about, he left out that story. Oh, he didn't talk about that, But you need to know, if you kind of know the backstory, it all makes sense. And there is also a new book that came out this year, book called the Jefferson Bible. This is actually a history, a biography of this book. It doesn't say that, it's not all that much about Jefferson's religion, but it's a history of the construction, the finding, and the uses of this book over time. And there are two books on Jefferson's religion. One is by a guy named Gosted, Edwin S. Gosted, a very famous church historian. This title, On the Altar of God. I like it a lot, but I think it's really not rigorous enough. There's a new book just published by Thomas Kidd, published by Yale, that I think is more rigorous, but I think it's relentlessly hostile to Jefferson. So I think we need something that's not quite so hostile as Tommy Kidd's book, and something more rigorous than the late Dr. Gosted's book. But if you're really interested in this topic, this little book is available on the Smithsonian, the Jefferson Bible. It does have a nice introduction. It says a little bit about Jefferson's belief, about how he constructed this book. And then it's just kind of fun to read. And in your own mind, you're comparing what you know when you're reading from the Gospels to what he's left out. And he tells you here every time, you can tell where he gives a little source note, so you can tell this is from Luke, or this is from Mark, or this is from Matthew.
So St. Paul's letters are irrelevant.
For him, it's just the Gospels. It's just the 4 Gospels.
It's, what is, if he's trying to free people from the control of the church.
Yeah.
How does he deal with sacraments and issues such as funerals and marriage with?
Jefferson was in some sense in behavior totally ordinary. He took communion. For example, George Washington never took communion. Jefferson takes communion. He does the sacraments. He does go out of his way to kind of parade his individualistic thought. He lives as a normal person. He made contributions, supports the church. He has his kids baptized. And so,
Does he include references to those?
no,
In his?
No. no,
Was he ever on the vestry?
yes. And I've actually found the microfilm copy of the vestry book that he was, when he was in the vestry. He doesn't say, he doesn't participate. He's very young. And in those days, you got on the vestry, but primarily because of who your father was. So he becomes a vestry member of the church, like when he's 25. So you can see what he says, but he's not, I'd say he's not active on the vestry. Okay.
How old would he have been at the turn of the century, 1800?
He was born in 1743. So it'd be 57 in 1800.
And then these writings on religion would have covered a lot of years toward the end of his life.
Well, he began thinking and writing about this stuff in the 1770s. And the Virginia State Religious Freedom in 1778. And then he has a lot of letters sprinkled all through there. And that letter to Joseph Priestley was in 1800. His syllabus is 1803. 1804 is that first version of the philosophy of Jesus. This Jefferson Bible compilation is 1820. But then he's quite an old man, 77. Yeah. Okay.
So what I heard you say regarding his motivation
Yes.
for this. Certainly, and this was, I guess I had understood something that he wasn't a Trinitarian, and
Yeah.
but you're refreshing me on that.
Yeah.
So he had some very vested personal interest, his family, his own personal situation for some of his things and some of his actions here.
Well, I would say that he understood theoretically that he was subject to legal punishment for his beliefs. He understood that it would be incredibly rare for a person of his eminence and prestige to be attacked. But he doesn't like the idea that he's protected by his name and by his family. He thinks that you should not have a society in which a person's safety to believe as you think is based on the whim of either the local sheriff or your father.
So that's kind of a theoretical
Yes,
approach. So there's the spectrum of pure theory
Yes.
and how it should be. And
yes,
there's also kind of, sometimes they align and sometimes they don't,
Yes.
a personal interest. I mean, if you just had a ballpark this talk, how much of this from Jefferson came, is 20% personal interest and 80% theoretical framework, or is it 50-50, or is that just a nonsensical
well, I
question?
would say if he had done it in 1801, right after the election of 1800, when he had been severely attacked by the New England clergy for being an atheist, enemy of the Bible, destroyed Christianity. At that time, he may have felt more personally endangered. I think 1820, he's successfully been president. He hasn't been arrested. He's now revered. So I think by the time he does this compilation, it's more theoretical.
Really much more on.
Yes, yes. But I mean, Jefferson changes all the time. And he said, I mean, he, like any intelligent person does. Like the Constitution says, I knew the guys who wrote the Constitution, they were great men. But said, you know, our society, we're an infant society. We're much more experienced now in government. We've learned, there've been advances in science and so forth. He says to expect a nation to be governed 40 years later by something that you wrote then would be like asking a child to wear a coat he wore when he was 5 years old. That as our society grows and learns, we become more experienced, that we should constantly be revising and updating our constitution and our laws. So in no way did he believe he were kind of stuck. And so you look at Jefferson in a whole variety of ways, Jefferson's views are evolving. And so people can talk about how Jefferson was being inconsistent. He's not being inconsistent, he's growing. I mean, I'd hate to know a person who at 80 believed exactly what they believed when they were 14. You know, and so some people somehow think you can find an inconsistency between Jefferson at 30 and Jefferson at 70. Well, that's because he's constantly learning and evolving on a whole range of issues. Susan?
I have the very good fortune of reading your book while I was in Richmond and took a side trip by myself over to Monticello until they kicked me out. I mean, I stayed there. But, and by reading your book and being there and seeing, you know, where he lived at his death and all that, you were able to, I was able to grasp what you just said. From his youth, from his marriage, from all of the different concepts and things all the way through his death. It was like watching somebody grow up in a very long time. Next question.
I thought that was a pretty succinct book.
That's why you're the professor. Next question. Did he have the word supper comment, the statements that Jesus is purported to make?
No, I don't believe that. Again, he is writing this for his own edification. If he were writing it for a larger public, he might have made it a little bit differently. But this is for his own one.
But isn't part of Jesus's history is his retention of core Jewish practices without all the fluff in them?
Jesus, yes.
So I think maybe he missed that if he didn't do some of the practices that purportedly were part of Jesus's dialogue, we missed some of the importance of his moral code.
Well, and also by saying for my else, by leaving out all the years, you have to wonder, how would he explain the incredible hold that Jesus had on his believers? I mean, clearly what set him apart from other preachers was miracles, healings, you know, and so it's kind of,
Yeah, except if everybody else is Thomas Jefferson
yes,
and has the intellect and the reason, Thomas, surely everyone else, even at the time of Jesus, who were observing this, would see the wisdom in his words and wouldn't need miracles.
no, no. He doesn't address them. I mean, for example, I wish you had had a beginning paragraph and say, here, for example, is my epistemology. Here is the verse. And here's how I determine what is authentic and what is not authentic. You just basically take it on word. You know, it's as clear to him as,
Explain your methodology.
yes, he doesn't. But again, he's not writing it for you or me. He's writing it for himself. So I think it's time for us to stop, isn't it?
It is. Wow, thank you. Dawn will be back October 1 and 8. No Sunday forum next week, Labor Day weekend. But the 11th we launch, and the first forum will be a conversation with the pastors about what are you needing? What are you wanting to study? When, where, how? So come for just conversation and have a
On 9/11.
On 9/11, yes, on 9/11, it is rally day, yeah. And yeah, 9/11. Blessings, everyone at home. Thanks for being here.